I've got a kid that's coming into my care who has a package of identity that's with them. I'm going to ignore that? That is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That is a bait and switch. It's a bait and switch. We started talking about we didn't like racial preferences. We ended talking about we don't like race at all. That second position hasn't been argued for. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't let these people resolve the ancient primordial question of American justice by the back of their hand to affirmative action. Don't let them take race off the table without an argument. Black people are so stupid that they'll be led around by the nose by you waving a shiny object of we appointed these black people to this thing and we got this DEI thing, but really?
Okay, good evening, everybody. We are going to get started with a mini preview of our main event with Professor Glenn C. Loury and Professor John McWhorter. So I will introduce myself, I'll introduce Professor Loury, and then we will all keep our fingers crossed about Amtrak, and eventually we'll introduce Professor McWhorter. We have a series of questions that we will pose for a dialogue between Professor Loury and McWhorter, but I'll start it off, and then we will leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Okay, so I'm Wendy Schiller. I am the interim director of the Watson Institute, and this is our last public event in our Dialogue Across Difference series at the Watson Institute this year. And as some of you may have heard, there's very exciting news. We have a dean of the new school, the Thomas J. Watson Jr. School of International and Public Affairs, Professor John Friedman of the Economics Department here at Brown. That was announced yesterday, and so we're all very excited and looking forward to what he will bring to the table to launch this school. So the Dialogue Across Difference series was launched by Watson this year to present views on key issues of the day and differing views, either in dialogue with two people or with one person and the audience. And as part of that spirit, I want to remind everybody about Brown's protest policy, which is that we encourage free speech always. And you are, during our Q&A, you're welcome to ask questions, but under no circumstances can you disrupt this talk or put up signage, for example, in protest that would block somebody's view, or make noise such that other guests cannot hear the conversation. That's all we ask. And this will be a lively conversation, a robust, and I think there'll be lots of areas that will be represented for a whole wide version of views. So I'm very excited about it. I want to introduce our first guest, Professor Glenn C. Loury, the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences at Brown University. He's an academic economist who has made scholarly contributions to the fields of welfare economics, income distribution, game theory, industrial organization, and natural resource economics. He's also a prominent social critic and public intellectual, having published over 200 articles in journals of public affairs in the United States and abroad on the issues of racial inequality and social policy. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a past vice president of the American Economics Association. Professor Loury has been a visiting scholar at Oxford, Tel Aviv University, University of Stockholm, the Delhi School of Economics, the Institute for the Human Sciences in Vienna, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was for many years a contributing editor of the New Republic magazine. I will say this is being recorded for the Glenn Loury Show, which is a very popular podcast. And we are very excited for the dialogue. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pose a very simple question to Professor Loury and begin the conversation. And certainly when Professor McWhorter arrives, we will stop and introduce him. Universities contribute to disseminating core ideas of liberal democracy and contribute to advances in technology, healthcare, and science, at least in the United States. Nearly 100% of the members of the U.S. House and Senate have at least a four-year college degree, and that includes Republicans and Democrats. But we remain at a stagnant 40% of the general public who has some college education. The Congress and the general public do not appear to be concerned with the current Trump administration's actions on research funding and student visas. At what point did higher education lose the general public, and why?
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Wendy. Thanks for the question. What a question. What a moment. What a moment we're in. I don't know the answer to the question. At what point did they? I mean, it seeped away by degrees, didn't it? I mean, we didn't get here in a day. I mean, I'll tell you what I think, and don't make me into a social historian. That would be me pretending. I think the barbarians are at the gates, and the crown jewels of civilization are in their sights. I think this, we're going to bring down Harvard, we're going to bring down Columbia, we're going to bring them to their knees, we're going to cut off their funding. Now, what kind of funding are they talking about? They're not cutting off the Middle East Studies Department. They're cutting off the School of Engineering. They're cutting off the Physics Department. They're cutting off the people who are generating the big grant money from the federal government, the healthcare and sciences and so forth and so on. So what's the argument? They're woke. As if there were no wisdom in a critical engagement with society, as if the intellectual function was purely to be in the service of whatever populist mantra is gaining the public assent in the moment. They're woke. I think these guys going through the precious crown jewels of our civilization with a sledgehammer are mischievous in the extreme. I'm not going to call them fascists. That would be too facile. But I think Christopher Rufo deposes the president of Harvard University with a tweet. That's pretty much what we're dealing with here. I don't have a brief for Claudine Gay as a great intellectual paragon, but I say Harvard University is a crown jewel of human civilization on this planet today. And tweets, it's beneath contempt. So you're going to sneer at the universities. This is where the mastery of our intellectual inheritance resides. You're going to give them the back of your hand. You don't know what the F you're talking about. You don't know what you're doing. So that's what I think. When did it happen? I don't know. Okay, is there blame enough to go around? Yeah, I wasn't against shouting down Ray Kelly when he came here to speak at Brown. I don't think federal judges should be prevented from speaking at Stanford Law School because they're conservatives. And the examples could be multiplied. I think, you know, we're arrogant, supercilious, smug, self-satisfied, so sure of yourselves. I think there's merit in Michael Sandel's critique of merit. I think the know-it-alls, when they lord it over people and they tell them they're getting what they deserve, they need to learn how to use a laptop, cultivate their own reaction of contempt that they have to live with afterwards. I think there's some of that. Who wants to go around campaigning for the cancellation of student loans now? Who wants to defund the police? Who wants to say looting is okay? The people who said and did those things help to contribute to the environment that we find ourselves in right now in cultivating this reaction. But it is a reaction. It's the barbarians at the gates. They're rummaging through our precious crown jewels of intellectual achievement, and they need to be stopped. That's what I think.
Who funds the news outlets that you rely on? What agendas shape their coverage? How accurate have they been in their reporting in the past? And if you don't know the answers to these questions, how informed are you, really? We all need tools to cut through the noise, spot bias, and see the full picture. The tool I use for this is Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, cut through the noise, and get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. I find it really helpful for gaining a balanced perspective in our hyperpolarized world. And they surface roughly 20 of these stories every day. To show you what I mean, here's the story that is not being covered by the left. China suggests COVID-19 originated in the US in response to Trump allegation. And here's one that's totally ignored by the right. Poll finds majority of Americans see Trump as, quote, dangerous dictator. For both of these, and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you don't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/GlennShow. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/GlennShow.
Let me push back a little bit, just from our own experience at Brown University for quite some time. And you and I have some familiarity with the different institution, the University of Chicago, for example. Thinking about an atmosphere in which students feel free in classrooms to speak their core beliefs, their core opinions, and to what extent, in terms of the balance of professors trying to cultivate an environment where students feel free to say what they think and debate, and then having students themselves punish or cancel or censor people who say things that offend them. What, if anything, should we have been doing as faculty? What, if anything, should universities have been doing 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to make true intellectual exchange an activity that students felt safe to do? And I think we can argue that they don't really feel truly safe to do that in a lot of the very elite crown jewel institutions that we're talking about. So where are we to blame for that? Are they to blame for that? This is a fundamental, not existential question. If you claim to be a crown jewel of civilization and education, yet you do not give voice to a multitude of opinions, even when they are offensive, and you believe, I think what I believe about that is that that should happen, then how do you claim the perch of crown jewel of civilization?
Yeah, that's a point. Like I said, I think, we made this bet that we're lying in to some degree. And I thought the arrogance and the kind of know-it-allism and the and contempt for heterodox opinion. Okay, thank you. Very close to the mic. This is what they tell me in podcast world. They say, get close to the mic. The mic is your friend. I mean, look, I plead not guilty to that charge. I have been speaking up in heterodox ways for a long time, and I encourage it in my classes. And I think students take my classes in part because they know that there's going to be a safe environment to be able to have more than one opinion. And I try to model this in my own intellectual practice. And, when John gets here, he and I can talk about, how you do that in real time. But I mean, the basic idea is humility. And it's a kind of, I don't know everything. Let me listen. Let me hear what other people have to say. And as far as safety for students are concerned, well, I taught for a couple of years a seminar called Free Inquiry in the Modern World. And it was all about, the foundation. I'm not a classicist, but, Plato came up. John Stuart Mill came up. John Milton came up. Alan Bloom came up. And the point was to explore the problem. And the problem is you say in public what you think about something that's controversial, and people will think what they think about you. They will harbor estimates of your character based upon your willingness to speak in particular ways. And you know that this is the case. And everybody knows that you know that this is the case. And that's a game that has equilibria that are interesting, that are sometimes characterized by you not saying what you really think, because the only people willing to say what you really think are people who are known to have socially unacceptable views about things like being anti-Semites or racist or sexist or they like Putin. They won't say what they think about this or that because they don't want to be thought to be that kind of person. You end up with a situation in which nobody who is not that kind of person, but who thinks this discredited thought is willing to say what they think. So the meaning of the saying becomes the thing that is discredited, and nobody will say it who doesn't want to be discredited, et cetera. The incentives work to make that a stable arrangement, and that's a problem. And I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit, but all I'm saying is that's what I want our students to see so as it doesn't spoil the precious opportunity that we have to learn from each other in a seminar where we're talking about complicated and controversial and sensitive matters. We want them to be able to know that the collective outcome is spoiled to the extent that the individuals are cowed. And, I teach this, I preach this. I try to exemplify it in my own practice, as I say. But if you're saying, these chickens that are coming home to roost now, Christopher Rufo, again, I don't mean disrespect, he's a journalist. And he's been very successful. The governor of Florida has recruited him to be an advisor about their changes of the state's higher education system. People read his articles and his views and whatnot. I don't mean to be personal. It's not personal. But he can't carry the book bag of some of these people intellectually. And if you allow his voice to be determinative in what's happening in your institution, you got a real problem.
So in thinking about this question of access, right? We think about sort of, okay, why is there so much resentment? Is this idea that it's hard to get into these schools? And then we think of premier jewel in the crown state schools, right? You can go all the way from Berkeley to the University of Rhode Island, which was just lauded for its accomplishments, to the University of Virginia, Michigan, we go on and on, Ohio State. They're all under financial attack as well in terms of cutting off the spigot of funding, and it will cripple them, possibly even more than it would cripple some of the wealthier private institutions. And this is the disconnect I can't figure out because they aren't being attacked by Christopher Rufo for these kinds of things, although there's a list of 60 schools, mostly in blue states. But what accounts for their silence? I mean, the complete and utter silence that you have in all these other jewels in the crown that are providing, you could argue, wider and more access to a more diverse set economically of students than perhaps Brown does or any other Ivy League school. This is the absence that I'm curious about. When I say general public, I'm not just saying people who voted for Donald Trump or didn't vote for Donald Trump. It's leaders and state legislators and people who run these massive schools that provide all of the workforce for their states, and they are silent. What can we do? What can we do about that? But what explains that silence?
Gosh, I don't know is again my answer. I mean, I could speculate, but I'm not sure what it would be worth. In an environment where there's a witch hunt going on, you keep your head down. I mean, you don't gratuitously invite controversy if you're worried that you're next in line, something like that. I don't know, Wendy.
Well, let me switch. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. I'm going to say something that's going to probably make people pretty unhappy in the room. Okay. What we know from some of the funding that has been shut off, not only the rationale of the Trump administration, but the money, the grants that have actually been stopped, worked, or canceled, many of them are related to what we call DEI or health concerns or other kinds of things. Oh, there he is.
Sorry, folks.
So I am going to introduce, we are thrilled that you made it. We've all been waiting and we're really very excited. So Professor John...
Huh? I was looking forward to this. I still am.
Good. All right. So Professor John McWhorter teaches linguistics at Columbia University as well as music history. He specializes in language change and language contact and is the author of The Missing Spanish Creoles, Language, Simplicity, and Complexity, and The Creole Debate, among others. He has written extensively on issues related to linguistics, race, and other topics for Time, the New York Times, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and elsewhere, and has been a contributing editor at The Atlantic. For the general public, he's the author of The Power of Babel, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Language Hoax, Words on the Move, Talking Back, Talking Black, and other books, including 9 Nasty Words and Woke Racism. both of which were New York Times bestsellers. He has also made several very impressive appearances on The Bill Maher Show, just saying, if you watch real time. He hosts the Lexicon Valley Language podcast, has authored 6 audiovisual sets on language for the Great Courses Company, and has written weekly for the New York Times since 2021. And we're very thrilled to welcome Professor John McWhorter. Okay, so we're gonna work backwards. We did start with one question, so we're gonna send it to you, and then we'll work backwards a little bit about yourself and your craft. So I will repeat the question in miniature, which is basically the Congress and the general public do not appear to be concerned with the current Trump administration's actions on research funding and student visas. Everybody in Congress, the House and Senate, has a 4-year degree at this point in time. At what point did higher education lose the general public and why? And we won't tell you what Professor Loury said in response to this question.
I'm not just being kittenish here when I say this, but I'm not sure what it means to say that the general public is not into universities, so that universities have lost the public, because most people, and I think this is really okay, don't go to college. I think if we're talking about the real world, most American human beings aren't thinking very much about colleges and universities at all, much less the political views that are expressed in them. I think we're really talking about people like us, and that's okay. But in terms of what got lost, certainly, it cannot be missed by, say, a parent of a child, or even these days, in my experience, the child's, so to speak, that in the name of education, as in being led out of ignorance, there are a great many people in university settings, colleges and universities, who genuinely think that education's heart is to teach people that the left is correct, or another way of putting it is to teach people social justice. For them, it's not that they're ideologues in a way that's evil. They genuinely wouldn't understand what else you would center your endeavors around. What else would you be curious about? Why else would you put forth the effort? And now there are 2 generations of departments that really have been taken over by that ideology, which is not always an evil thing, by no means, but it can be overdone. And it does give an air of ridicule. It used to be that if someone said about an environment like this that universities are run by tenured radicals, that in 1991 was a cartoon. I didn't recognize it, and I was at Berkeley, and I didn't recognize it. That kind of person was one person in the room who you needed to hear from. Now it's not a cartoon. I think that you really could say that that is what has happened to many fields. And so I would say that it was that, but it's not the public. I think that's a whole different issue. And to be honest, I think fewer people should go to college. I think that we've really overdone that since World War II. But if we're talking about college-oriented people, then what I said before.
I want to ask John a question. I know we're supposed to be having dialogue, so let me just jump right in.
Is that? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so teach them that the left is right. Okay, obviously that is bad. Okay, they should teach them to think. But what I want to ask is the role that critical assessment of incumbent and received order of doing business of the institutions which we inhabit, a critical attitude of them, asking questions about the extent to which they are what they say that they are, about who benefits and who doesn't, and about how they work. And, being aware of the questions of justice and the threats to our decency that are posed by some of the, in other words, the program of the left. Doesn't that have a central place in any serious intellectual engagement with our social relations with one another? I mean, could you have come out of the Industrial Revolution and watched the rise of industrial capitalism and not have had a Karl Marx or somebody like it raising the questions that he raised? Not that he's right or wrong about any particular thing, but to just be rubber stamping the incumbent received doctrine, that's not what we want. So, no, the left is not, in virtue of being the left, right. But critical engagement with the important questions of our social life is of a central purpose of the university. In the 1960s, wouldn't you have wanted a critique of the Vietnam War to emerge on campuses to challenge the powers that be, to demand accountability, to raise questions about the rationale for the huge things that were being undertaken. Where else would you have expected that to come from, but from the university? So where's that factor in your assessment of things?
The issue is emphasis. And so, yes, who benefits and who doesn't is something that's most likely going to be discussed in a setting like a university and should be. It should be one of maybe 6 or 7 focuses, though, and not the one that's considered, even in a tacit sense, to be the most important one, because it's just one question about existence. So, for example, to narrow that a little bit, who benefits? Yes, that sounds like it's translated from Thomas Aquinas, and maybe it is. But there's a difference between who benefits and let us study how certain people abuse or have too much power over others, and think about how that makes us indignant and how we might think of battling it, although often the battling is just in the form of using certain words and striking certain positions, especially now that we have social media. That's too narrow. That's not what who benefits should be. So I just think that we should foster curiosity. And that's one of many things to foster curiosity about. But if it's only that, it's not an educational mission that I recognize. Even Vietnam War, I'm glad that that was discussed the way it was and was often messy. But for that particular kind of orientation to society to then become what's considered default enlightenment in college town, no, it's too narrow. There's too much interesting out there.
Okay.
Okay. Let's take an easy question. If we are, in fact, seeing the end of what I call, I was beginning to talk about this, DEI, because so many of the programs that have been canceled so far have been DEI or LGBTQ focused, and that has been a firm sort of justification by the Trump administration. But we've seen affirmative action challenged for more than a decade now in the courts. If we are at the end of what we call DEI, affirmative action, efforts at inclusivity, even in research programs, what are the benchmarks that we might use to assess whether affirmative action was a success or a failure?
Yeah, let me take an opening crack at that. So my line of attack on the question is to distinguish between affirmative action struck down by the Supreme Court in its famous decision of 2023, finding that the use of racial preferences and admissions practices by public universities is in conflict with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and by private universities violates titles of congressional statutes that have been signed into law, is one thing. DEI, which I'm not going to attempt to give a comprehensive definition of, but I mean attention to the identitarian interest and demands and needs of a student body, which is composed of people of varied racial and ethnic and religious and so on, and making an environment that cultivates a commodious reception and nurture of such people on the identitarian dimensions is another. Those are not the same things. The Supreme Court did not say that it is somehow against the American legal order to be concerned about the identities that people bring when they come into our environment. The decision to disattend them is a different matter altogether than constitutional entitlement. What I'm saying is, I'm treating people at a point of admissions where I'm allocating a benefit. Don't do that in a racially preferential way. Okay. I mean, I've been saying that for 30 years. Another thing is, I've got a kid that's coming into my care who has a package of identity that's with them. I'm going to ignore that? That is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That is a bait and switch. It's a bait and switch. We started talking about we didn't like racial preferences. We ended talking about we don't like race at all. That second position hasn't been argued for. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't let these people resolve the ancient primordial question of American justice by the back of their hand to affirmative action. Don't let them take race off the table without an argument.
which they couldn't make, is the point.
Well,
And
that's
so-
my position.
Yes, and therefore I would agree with what you're saying, which is that the way DEI does things, the whole conception of what inclusion is, the whole conception of how you reach equity, is a kind of performance art that I think too many people have been allowed to now professionalize, especially for the past 10 years. Again, I don't think of them as evil people. I do terrible things too that I'm not aware of. I know that all of them think that they are doing good. They should not be thought of as evil people. But what they're doing is not based on any sophisticated conception of social justice, of real equity. It fetishizes identity to a point that doesn't make any kind of logical sense. And so the idea is to get rid of those excesses while not allowing people whose basic idea is, let's not stir up any of that race stuff, as if racism doesn't exist, as if race and identity are complete fictions, which they aren't, although some people would wish that they were. If they're ever going to be, it's not going to be for many generations from now. So I would agree. I would agree with what you're saying. There is no argument they could make that we're going to eliminate race completely. It's just an Archie Bunker, go a little further up, Al Bundy. Who would it be now? Nobody. Peter Griffin. If you had a conversation with Peter Griffin on Family Guy, we're near there about race. The sort of thing he would say about how we need to stop stirring that stuff up, and Cleveland will get angry. That is what we need to ignore, because Peter could, I shouldn't use him, but that person, Donald Trump, could not make that argument. There is no coherent argument there because we live in this world.
So
Yeah, too much agreement.
Right. So now I'm gonna. Maybe there won't be agreement now. So to follow up on that, to push when people talk about these grants getting cut off, what they say is the Biden administration required us to put in components that were DEI specific and or targeted towards addressing concerns in the LGBTQ community in order to get the money. You're going to hear that whether you're going to hear it in public or you're going to hear it in private. That is the case. So there were strings attached under a Democratic, quote unquote, liberal, progressive administration to having research money at institutions. So the Trump administration is canceling all of those grants. So what is your assessment of the balance between a Democratic administration or a Republican administration and the relationship it has to funding education? Haven't liberals and progressives tried to push higher education in a direction with its funding in a way now that the Trump administration is doing by withdrawing that funding?
Well, the problem is that if the funding is conditioned in that way, then it can be misinterpreted as a way of tacitly making being white a disadvantage. And that's what we've seen too often. The idea being that we're not supposed to use anyone white at all, especially if they're a man. Because once you do that, then the whole issue of merit gets basically turned on its head. That's a major aspect of this, whether it led to that. Sometimes it led to that because people were being too cautious. Sometimes it led to it because there's a certain kind of person whose sense of social justice is that now it's non-white people's turn. And you would have to ask, well, for how long? Some of them, I guess, would say for 400 years, but it's now our turn. And therefore, the white man shouldn't get the job. And that's, of course, a rather unhumanizing and short-sighted way of thinking. But that's a lot of what these pre-Trump initiatives ended up leading to, even if that wasn't the idea, especially after March of 2020, when we entered into a new mood because of a cocktail of sociological factors that could not have been predicted, but that we're living with the legacies of since.
Yeah, right? I don't disagree with anything John said. I think they overplayed their hand, the Democrats. I think, again, it's not my area of expertise, but it might be yours, about how the Democratic Party works, about who the various interest groups are, about how they, when they get into positions of administrative responsibility, they allow their ideological commitments to color how they, deploy their portfolio, about what the campaign organizers are telling the elected officials about what they need to do and how they need to message and how they need to appeal to the various segments of the electorate and whatnot. I mean, I don't know how many federal judges Joe Biden appointed, but I assure you that the proportion of them who were Black women is vastly in excess of the proportion of Black women in the relevant demographic because, you're appointing federal judges and you want Black women. Joe Biden ran for president telling us that he was going to appoint a woman and a Black woman, his running mate, and so on and so on. And that the politics of that kind of pandering, which is contemptible. I mean, Black people are so stupid that they'll be led around by the nose by you waving a shiny object of, we appointed these Black people to this thing and we got this DEI thing, but, really? But that would take us off point. We were talking about universities.
Glenn, though, just for the record, there's a person who would say that, Glenn, you should know, when we do this online, I always give this person a name. I'm not going to do that here. It doesn't feel right. But her name is Beverly. Okay. And Beverly is a Black woman of stature in this life. And she tells you, Glenn, she's praying, Glenn, you ought to know.
She's called Stacey Abrams, but go ahead.
She's not. She's Constant Baker Motley's daughter. And she says, you ought to know that there was a time when someone like me had no hope of getting any higher than XYZ. Here we are. It's only been about 10 minutes. And frankly, it's our turn. Don't you think it's our turn? Yes, it's disproportionate, but it's our turn for the chance. And do you think that all of those white male judges before named Potter and things like that were all equally competent and geniuses? Some of the Supreme Court justices were frankly even kind of dumb back in the 50s. That's what.
Yeah, to which there's an answer. Two wrongs don't make a right is the first answer. But the second answer is the year's 2025, not 1975. You better watch out. The backlash is coming. You think people don't hear you? You think they don't know what's going on? It's ironic beyond belief that it was non-white, non-Black plaintiffs who brought affirmative action down. The country is moving on. The world is moving on. You're still playing the Jim Crow card?
So do you give no credence to lived experiences? I mean, it's a real question. So when you think about DEI, you think about anti-Semitism, you think about the Trump administration's manipulation of these concepts to divide people based on identity or lived experience or historical experience. Do you not think a Black female judge is going to take any kind of case that comes in her courtroom with a different perspective than a white male judge? Do we really think lived experiences do not inform the adjudication in any space?
Well, yeah, lived experience do, but race is not a good substitute for lived experience.
Anymore.
Really? And gender isn't either?
Really? Well,
I would say gender more than race. We're all thinking about Ketanji Brown Jackson, for example. She is younger than me, went to school at a time that I remember. I remember what race was like, and she does a great job. But in terms of her lived experience as a Black person who grew up rather comfortable with lots of experience with white people who were very well-meaning, the occasional racist thing, they've certainly happened to me in my life, but not enough, I would say, for that to constitute a lived experience that would be especially relevant to jurisprudence. Not enough. There's this much that you're supposed to decide on. This much will be about race. And in terms of, I have nothing against her, but we have to use real people. It's not Beverly. In terms of her lived experience in the 1980s, 90s, aughts, and teens, I don't think it's enough to make that decision worth it. It's just that having the occasional scrape with racism or having been somewhat less affluent than most of the people around you, I don't call that a lived experience relevant to jurisprudence. I call that just something that distinguishes you from some other people. I know that sounds ice cold, but I wouldn't say it in 1950, but I'm saying it in 2025.
And would you extend that to all professions, college professors, construction workers, lawyers, doctors, across the board?
Yes. And I'm flying by the seat of my pants, but yes, especially because these days, white people are not fountains of informativeness necessarily, but they are much more sensitive to these things, especially in the settings that we're often talking about, which is not all of those, than they used to be. And so, for example, some of the most insightful comments about inequality that I hear in my classes come from very white kids, which was not true when I was my college student's age. But progress happens. It's easier to say it doesn't happen than to admit that it happens slowly. So I would say, flying by the seat of my pants, there must be one profession where there's an exception. But in general, yes.
Yeah, let me add to that. Stereotyping. I see the person, I see their race, I see their exogamy, I see what their skin color is and what their hair texture is. And I think I know something about them, lived experience. So I impute to them a certain set of presumptions about how their lives have gone, which may or may not be accurate about those particular individuals. Or let me flip the script, not say the lived experience of a Black person. Let me say the lived experience of a white person. If I were you, I'd feel very uncomfortable having anybody making any assumptions about how I experience life based upon the fact that I'm white. How superficial can you get? I mean, everybody's got a story. And sometimes the ethical force of the story is entirely driven by the fact that it's counter the narrative. The white working class person who struggles or whatever, or the wealthy privileged person who deals with drug addiction and all the other kind of pitfalls and snares and has to come to terms with, what their human condition is. So that we oughtn't to dwell on the racialized lived experience presumptions. We might not ignore them, but we oughtn't to live there. We ought to be casting our vision higher. We ought to be trying to think about universalism. We ought to be thinking about the human condition.
Glenn, do you really mean, this is a genuine question, do you mean that we shouldn't ignore them? Because I was waiting for you to really push it against
Well, like Justice Roberts says in his opinion, where he says it's an out, really. He says, you're going to write an essay and you're going to tell me about your life. And if race happens to come up as a part of you telling me the story about your life and it's relevant to your story, okay, I'll hear you out. But I'm not going to presume anything about you in virtue of the fact that you simply cited your race or checked the box. I'm against that. And he thinks the Constitution is against that kind of racial stereotyping when you're dispersing public benefits.
So you believe that human beings are capable of empathy simply because another person is a human being. They're recognized as such. People view them as completely human. And that we are all, go back to the Greeks, that we are actually capable of empathy without any of those sort of superficial or self-identified bonds of commonality, that we can be empathetic without considering any of this.
No, what I'm saying is that race in and of itself is an insufficient category to provide those bonds of commonality.
Okay. Well, Michael Dawson's not here to defend this position, but I'm going to switch gears because we have so little time. And because we're in a universe, not because of Amtrak, not because of you. I meant in
in life.
The continuum of time. We're in an academic setting, so I have to ask this, which is tenure. We talk about tenure. I have tenure, full disclosure. I believe my colleagues here have tenure. And let's think about civil service employment protections, the federal civil service, state civil service, and it's coming under attack, this idea that you can have a job for life, even though, go back to the Pendleton Act of 1883, but nonetheless, can you say that tenure is still a necessary component of higher education in the sense that it enables or allows professors to encourage the freest expression and thought in themselves and their students? Or do you see a time when it should or could be modified and come under the same sort of attack that civil service employment protection is now?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it as an economist. We're writing contracts now. We're elaborating what the terms of employment are going to be and what the commitments over a period of time are going to be. And I see the argument about academic liberty not being threatened by the possibility of termination of employment conditional on saying the wrong thing. So a person launches a research project knowing that their position is secure against the possibility that they could get on the wrong side of whatever popular whim or fancy happens to be the order of the day. And I see the benefit of that. But I also see the cost of it. I see that there are incentive issues that have to be reckoned with. And I see that there are, in a dynamic world where there are successive generations coming along, and the institution may get clogged with people who are, well, staying past their use-by date, no longer productive. And, what can you do? You can't get rid of them. This is a problem. So it's a question of balancing these equities. I think we have an incumbent system, and it's going to be hard to just flip a switch and get out of the business of tenure with people building career expectations and already having been granted entitlements. And then now you got a two-tier system where the younger personnel are not subject to the same benefits as the older and so on. So that's a problem. But I, you know, and what do we rely on to solve the incentive problem in the absence of the ability to terminate the employment of non-productive tenured faculty? We rely on social pressure. Can't look my colleagues in the eye at the lunch table because I haven't published anything the last 5 years, and they know it. And the graduate students are all flocking down to the other end of the corridor because I'm not up to anything, and I'm lonely, and and I'm shamed, and I'm an also-ran, and I'm not a player anymore. I'm not a player. And anybody who's read my book knows I want to be a player. Anyway, you see what I'm getting at. We're writing contracts, and the question is, what are the rules going to be? And what the equities that are being weighed are the incentive structure of the dynamic contract on the one hand versus the guarantee of the security of being able to explore dangerous, controversial questions without fear of losing your job on the other. And I don't have a general answer to that. I have a framework for analyzing it.
The thing is, Glenn, as we both know, that professor who's kind of down the hall, they usually don't care. They're kind of just enjoying that they can't be fired, and they're doing other things. They do administrative work, et cetera. That's the person who you have be chair more than 2 times and things like that. There is a deadwood problem. I remember seeing it a lot when I was, I shouldn't have said that, but I just did. And it's all right. When I was at Berkeley, I saw that among some professors who I was very close to and whose work I admired. That's just a problem. But to me, I guess it's a little selfish. I am inclined to think that we have to protect people from being fired for not cutting their clothes to fit this year's, who said that? Lillian Hellman, this year's fashions, because I wouldn't have gotten tenure if I had become radioactive just a couple of years later than I did. First of all, my response to the Oakland controversy over whether or not Black English should be used as a teaching tool, I, as a great fan of Black English, said that's not what's going to help. And that was considered as if I had said that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or something. There are people who won't speak to me to this day because of that, and that was now 400 years ago. Then also, Creole languages. I'm not even going to get into it, but I have a vision of how they came about. I praise them. I've frankly written a full-length grammar of one of them, but I'm seen as anti-Creole because of certain in-group arguments, such that nobody who does Creole studies, except for 1 or 2 people now, would give me a tenure letter if I hadn't come up with that just after I got tenure, which was an accident. That happens to people. And also, if we're going to turn academia around, then there's going to have to be a time when a certain, I hate to say, hyper-woke establishment have as few levers as possible for denying tenure to perhaps a new generation of professors who start coming in and pushing back against that sort of thing. So I worry. I see these executioners, and I figure we have to have a break on that. But maybe that's just because I'm inside of my own head. Glenn, I don't think you happened to undergo that particular issue with getting tenure, and so, but
no, I didn't.
It just concerns me.
Well, that's good for the two of you and for me. But what is the value of tenure to the students sitting over there and the students sitting over there? What is the value of tenure to the people who are coming here to be educated? How does that translate into a more vibrant, open, intellectual experience for them?
They can't be deprived of the presence of a professor who has an idea that's different from the mainstream just because of that. That's very important for them.
But there's more. There's more to it. So while I'm trying to get tenure because I've got research projects, because I've got papers under revision and review at the journals, and I need 6 of them to get tenure, I am not thinking about how I'm going to teach this class tomorrow, and I am not holding office hours with my students in which we explore in an open-ended discussion what the books that we're reading actually mean, because I don't have time for that. I've got a teaching assistant who is a fresh, inexperienced graduate student who's actually meeting with the students because I'm getting tenure. So, it's a complex problem.
Is that a thing for real?
You mean not teaching at your full capability because you're busy doing your research?
Yeah.
I think so. It used to be a thing.
I didn't.
Until yesterday.
I I know what you mean in general, but I didn't know that it was something that happened as somebody was in.
Well, let's put it differently. Let's look at a typical department at a typical university and ask the question, who's spending time with the undergraduates? And ask about the allocation of that burden of responsibility at the university between tenured and non-tenured faculty members. And my guess is that the per capita burden bearing is higher amongst the non-tenured faculty members. But I mean, that we could find that out.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about the American public that goes to college or doesn't go to college, and thinking about what we believe is essential for accountability of elected officials, which is some level of knowledge. Reminding those, I have some students who are my philosophy of the founding class. John Adams wrote into the Constitution of Massachusetts, 1780, a right to public education. It's in the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts. So what does that education consist of now that will be accessible to people with college or without college, that says this is the preferred society, this is the rule of law, this is how we want to live? How do we think about that in this environment, translated across the country in terms of education, from social media consumption to the fact that sometimes students don't read a full book, sometimes they don't even read a full chapter? And we speak as if people are going to read the whole book. You slave over your conclusion and your introduction and your conclusion and everything in between because you think they're not skimming, but they're skimming. So what do we do about that if that's the elite? And what do we do about that fundamental component of the relationship between education and what we believe is a pillar of the preservation of democracy?
Well, if I could blow it all up and start again, there should be 13 grades. This is not my idea. This is Leon Botstein of Bard's idea. There should be 13 grades. College should be for people who've really got to have it. But an awful lot of education should be packed into everything up through 13th grade. And we'd have to make a decision as to what it was supposed to be and how national and how uniform. That's now a 40-year-old discussion. But we would do it that way. But also, getting people to read books the way all three of us did, I think the horse is out of the barn. And I completely understand why, because there's this. And it really does. I don't mean anything specific, but I mean these phones. That distracts one. And if you've grown up with it, I can't see how they would have the same relationship to folios that we did. Because I force myself to read for 1 hour every day because I can feel how easy it would not to be to do it. But it's in half-hour chunks because I can't go any longer than that before looking at the phone. Now, imagine if I was 16 or 20. I fully get it. But you can use things online productively. There is a lot of good teaching online these days. And I don't mean the great courses, although the great courses separate mine from all of them. The great courses are really, really good. Those people do really good audio-visual work. And my sense is that a lot of people who are 20 learn as much from them on Audible as they would from some tome. So I'm trying to accept that because, no, I can't assign my students as much now as I used to. They're not going to do it. That doesn't mean they're dumb, but they get so much of their information from this. And so I figure a lot of it will be in there. Am I crazy to think of it that way? Am I giving up, you think?
I don't know. I think a couple of things. I think cultivate intellectual curiosity and an interest in the life of the mind from a very early age. I'm not a pedagogue. I don't know how exactly one does that as one is introducing young people to what is our cultural inheritance. I assume a lot of it would have to do with reading books, reading literature. But I grant you, picking up, War and Peace is more than a notion.
Oh, not that.
Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, Anna Karenina.
Those aren't for children. Well,
No. You cultivate the curiosity and the habit of mind such that by the time they're able to absorb these things, they know that they're there. It's a mountain. You don't climb the mountain on day one. You put on your boots, you go up the hill, you develop your legs and your muscles and your stamina, and you look up at the mountain and you appreciate its majesty and you begin your ascent, something like that. But what I'm trying to say is lifelong learning where it's a question of the disposition. It's a appreciation for the wonder, a kind of wide-eyed wonder at the discovery of things. And I don't know what the technology is going to offer. I'm sure we can't anticipate entirely what artificial intelligence, which is remaking our world even as we speak, will offer. But the spirit of it ought to be human culture is a magnificent thing. Don't miss it.
And don't only be interested in the fact that people do horrible things to each other.
Oh, that.
Yeah, and that's really important. So, for example, fostering curiosity in kids. I'm not a pedagogue either, but like one thing I did with my daughters is this place that we spend the summer. I got a bug net, like on an old TV show. And we collected bugs, and we got a few praying mantises. Put that thing in a big tank. It wasn't really that big, but we put it in, and we gave it food, and we put other praying mantises in, and they learned about this exotic creature that you're not going to learn about generally in Queens. That sort of thing, to foster curiosity. Or to say, you're outside, they're doing construction, and you can see all the pipes underground. I would stop them and say, girls, look, this is something you don't see every day. Take a look at this now. This is how water gets into our house. That. And to me, that works better than saying, here, this is Little House on the Prairie. I had to read it. Now you're going to read it too. Because they don't get it, you know.
But this is not about Little House on the Prairie. I mean, Dostoevsky was about power, struggle for power, struggle for place, struggle for survival. That's Dostoevsky, right? This is, some people could think, and I think some students in the room could think, we are living now in what could be that. So particularly at the most elite levels of our educational system, I'm not accepting this sort of let's inch by inch by inch. If you are here, you have a responsibility to your society. How do you instill and inculcate that? That is one of the reasons we justify our existence in higher education. So I'm not hearing a lot that helps fight back against people who don't want to forgive student loans, who want to crush research funding, who want us to go all away. And if we want to argue that we're going to serve this fundamentally important purpose for humankind, how do we instill that in the people we're trying to teach?
I would venture to say that one does not have to read all of Crime and Punishment. It's a great work, but maybe just assign a part of it, and not just 3 pages, but enough for them to understand. I have to assign students in one of the courses that I teach all of Plato's Republic. It's a great piece of work. However, as the years have gone by, it's ever clearer that they're using certain artificial means. And I think, well, suppose we took 50 pages of it and really went over them with a fine-tooth comb. I'm not sure that would be such a terrible thing. Although even there, maybe I'm giving in to the kids. But it's been my approach, especially over the past 2 or 3 years. Pandemic changed things also. Attention spans.
I'm okay with all of that.
You're okay with all of that?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, I said what I thought. I thought that the cultivation of an interest in intellectual pursuits broadly understood was the most important thing. And the question of pedagogic method was something I wasn't qualified to comment on. But the goal should be to engage with human culture in a serious way and to understand the majesty of it and to be challenged to enter into this in this pursuit. And it should be a lifelong undertaking. But what that says about K through 12 or what that says about college, I don't know. I mean, maybe it says college shouldn't be like summer camp. Maybe it says it's not about having a good time. It's not about the parties. It's not about how well equipped is the gymnasium and how many accoutrements we have in the dormitory facilities. Maybe a boot camp college is the right idea. Maybe all the action is in the interaction with other students over ideas and with faculty over ideas, not in getting in the fraternity or the sorority or the eating club or whatever it might be. Maybe that's part of the...
But do you think that the Republican administration, that is currently Republican administration, the Trump administration, would be going so hard after elite education if they didn't see a threat to the product of elite education to their hold on power?
Yes.
You do think they would be going, even if they don't believe that?
Well,
I think you're imputing a sense that they have of a hold on power that they should have that I'm not sure I see in most groups of people, and especially this particular group of people who are hazy of definition and professionally unreflective. I worry that the way that you're describing it, I get it completely, is something you perceive from the outside more than something that they feel. I think that their intent is much cruder than that. They're insulted by and weary of what they see as divisive ideology. Maybe a little bit of elitism is something that bothers them, but I think it's less we need to have power to enforce our agenda. That might be the Project 2025 people. Maybe they were thinking that way. But for all the other ones, it's just get rid of that stuff that's ruining the fabric of the country. That's my sense of it. Just like I don't believe that there's a such thing as white people will only give up power when they decide which, the woman at the store behind the shopping cart. It looks that way to Eldridge Cleaver, but that's not the way it is. So it's the same thing. That's just my bias.
I have a friend, he's a former naval aviator, a graduate of Annapolis. He flew and landed jet planes on aircraft carriers. He became an executive at Bell Helicopter, and he became an undersecretary of a naval department in the Republican administration. And he's now on boards of corporations. He makes a lot of money, and he knows the insiders in the Republican Party and in the game. And he said, when I complained, "This is an assault on the crown jewels of Western civilization by know-nothings." He said, "No, it's not. This is a show of power and an illustration of the golden rule. The golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules." And this is the administration saying, we got the gold, you guys. Man up and woman up, new sheriff in town. And it's about a display of power. Do they think, really, that the Middle East Studies Department is a threat to the Trump administration? I don't think so. They have the views that they have about what the Middle East Department is saying about a particular conflict in our time, and they want them to shut the F up. And they're throwing their weight around to that effect. I mean, imagine taking Edward Said under federal receivership to decide whether or not his books about Orientalism were worth reading or not. They may or may not be worth reading, but I damn sure don't want an apparatchik telling me.
So that leads to my last question, then we'll open up for about 10 or 15 minutes of audience questions, which is, in recent weeks, if we're told Carnegie Foundation just gave 25 scholars money to study polarization. 25 scholars. Polarization. I'm a skeptic. Okay, so here it is. If we accept we are more polarized than ever before, which I don't think we have to accept, but we have seen in recent weeks voters and or just regular people attending town halls have been going to town halls across the country when they are held by Democrats and Republicans and voicing concerns about a range of issues, including veterans, Social Security, the things you think might be more sort of stereotypical, the things you'll complain about, but also backlash against revoking visas indiscriminately and deporting people without due process. And these are people getting up and saying, I'm a Republican, I voted for Trump, I don't like this, this isn't who I want to be. It's not it's not organic, right? It's being encouraged in a lot of ways, but it is dispersed across for different districts that don't look like each other. And my question is, do you believe this could be an inflection point that starts to push back on the notion that we are irrevocably divided? That there are some points of commonality to this the very thing that you were just saying about sort of the use of power? Do you think that's an overreach, or do you think that's possible?
No, I think it's possible. I think if the left can overplay their hand, the right can overplay their hands. I think the economy is critical here. I think if the market goes down and stays down, the president mucks around with the independence of the Federal Reserve Board, the tariffs blow up in his face, and we end up with inflation and stagflation. I think it could get pretty bloody for Trump and company. So I do think, the lay of the land is fluid. I'm an economist. I'm not a trade economist, but everybody I talk to a person, there's not a whole lot of debate about this, is like, this is disaster. You're going to do tariffs based on bilateral trade balance calculations? That's just, stupid. I mean, and it is stupid. And do you really want one man, the chief executive, one person, the chief executive of the country, deciding who the governors are of the Federal Reserve Board with the ability to take scores of trillions of dollars of assets and move them this way or that at his whim? I don't think so. So, I mean, it's not really controversial. They're rolling the dice here. I mean, I'm 77 years old, man. I'm counting on my 401k, okay? I mean, I sure hope they get it right. I mean, I got people telling me, get into treasuries. And I don't want to take the hit of selling out at the bottom of the market. You know what I'm saying? But I sure hope they get it right. I'm rooting for Trump here, but I think he's out on a ledge. I mean, I'm rooting for him not because it's pro-Trump, but because it's my 401k.
I think that we are possibly on the cusp of what seems almost a deliberate kind of wisdom of crowds consensus based on what's happened since the middle of the last decade, where starting in 2020, I think that we saw a particular kind of woke leftism given a lot of power. And I think that it became clear that that was an unhealthy extreme to an extent. I think general society moved against accepting the most extreme version of that wokeism. It's not an accident that now we're talking about the woke right, as in that same kind of extreme, and I think especially lately, draconian, bizarre, sloppy work coming from the right, which most people are going to understand there is something terribly wrong with. And so that means that perhaps in the late 2020s, we'll see there being a kind of an intelligent center that can rule, that is based on what most people think, regardless of party. We're not going to go back to there being conservative and liberal Republicans a la 1955. But I think that we might be seeing something that rejects both extremes of illiberalism. And that has to be a healthy thing in itself. I would give it 3 years at this point. And how many months? I haven't been doing the countdown lately. But
I think we're at 100 days. May 1st is 100
right,
days.
So 9. Yep, so yeah, about like that.
Yeah, I'm going to close and open it up for questions. I will add that if you look at some of the most recent polling this week, and I know we have mixed feelings about polling, some major polls are all going in the same direction, which is sometimes the thing that you look for on indicators of the economy, on immigration, on deportation. It's very interesting to see such a quick shift across a bunch of different polls. So we'll have to see if that sticks or they push back. We'll have to wait and see. So you could come up and ask the question, but we're going to distribute the microphone if you don't want to get up.
Okay. This is a question mostly for Professor Loury, but obviously both of you. So for years on your podcast, you've been campaigning against the whole woke DEI left-wing capturing of elite institutions. And you said you declined to say who you voted for on the pod, but you did say that you were relieved that Trump won. But I've noticed that since Trump won, there's been a huge shift in your tone when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the left wing of America. And I'm wondering, what did you expect from Trump? And how is that different than what you've been so disappointed by?
Oh, boy. So, look, John and I have been around the block on more than one occasion. He's very interested in how I respond to this.
I am.
Because I was against the TDS-driven kind of Trump is bad, Trump is bad, Trump is bad, when I wanted to say, why is he so successful if he's so bad as a political phenomenon in our time? You're directing your attention in the wrong direction. You're making a characterological argument. Trump is bad, when you need to be making a political argument. The country is at a point where this kind of, let me call it demagoguery, I know that's a little pejorative, is effective. That's why I mentioned Michael Sandel's book, Tyranny of Merit, because I think he's making an important argument about the preconditions. That's why I think the rise of populism in the world, in Asia, as well as in Europe, as well as in North America, as well as in Latin America, needs to be attended to as a part of this discussion. The tectonic plates are shifting, I would have said in the old podcast days when the rise of Trump was an imminent phenomenon and you could see that something was going on, that the elites were losing traction and losing credibility, and that there was a hunger in people for something, that they got tired of being having fingers wagged in their faces and being lectured about their social and ethical hygiene when they were just basically evidencing common sense in the face of overwrought, overdone, overextended woke initiative. So I said to people who were going crazy about Trump, it's not about Trump. It's about the people who support Trump. When you say he could never be president, this guy, what you're saying is the people who support him can never have their way with our politics. Now, you're not addressing them. You're pointing your finger at their avatar, at their tribune. And you're saying he's a womanizer, he's a rapist, he's a failed businessman, he's
I
a
didn't
whatever.
say any of those.
Okay.
Anyway, I get it. Go ahead.
Not to put words in John McWhorter's mouth. I'm saying where I was coming from in the anti-Trump phase. Then January 6, 2020 happened. 2021. You know, the riot, the uprising, the whatever. And Trump handled it the way he handled it, and he handled it in the subsequent period since then, and he's still handling it this way. I really won that election, is what he's saying. Think about the damage that kind of rhetoric coming from the chief executive officer with a large following does to the sinew of the institutions that we're resting on. This is irresponsible. And this is only one of a number of irresponsible things. So I'm saying, you know, chickens have come home to roost here. You know, I didn't want to be against Trump for just the sake of being against Trump. Now we have Trump, and let's take a good look at what Trump is that we have. I'm still hopeful that it could go in a different direction for our country. But somebody has grabbed the country by the throat, or maybe by the cojones, and won't let go until they get their way. And I feel trepidation in the extreme at that prospect. And like I say, I'm watching my 401k.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your thoughts so far. So a few minutes ago, Professor Schiller mentioned that, like, really the purpose of all of us going into higher education is to serve society. But more and more, I feel like I see my classmates pursuing their own financial interests, like careers in investment banking and consulting more than anything else. Whether they're on the left or the right, people don't seem to be going into government or nonprofit work or even just like regular businesses to try to further all these things that we could think are the right thing to do. And so I'm wondering why you think that is. I'm not sure if it's always been like that or if this like sort of brain drain towards just these like really high caliber jobs is new, and what can we do to change that?
It's not new. I remember when I was in college, which is now 40 years ago plus, noticing that it felt like every other student was majoring in economics or the like and was going to go out and make money. And this was students of all kinds. That was ordinary. People like me, the sort of nerdy types, would walk around saying, nobody here seems like they want to go out and be a scholar or to try to change the world. And the people we were talking about were good people. I think it's gotten worse as more and more and more people are able to go to college, because I think that the idea that a critical mass of young people are going to spend 4 years, maybe especially on a campus, living in a dormitory, being taught about Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, et cetera. I think that's a peculiar goal that only started to seem like a norm after 1945. And so if as many people are going to go to college as they are, even at a Brown, a great many more than one might prefer, if one is the kind of person that perhaps you are and that I certainly am, are supposing that the idea of college is to learn to go out into the world and make it a better place. I assume that that's always going to be a minority position. I'm not saying that I like it, but I wouldn't say that it's new. I wouldn't say that it's new at all. Glenn, I can't take it further back than the 80s, but
I can. I started college in the 60s, so there. Oh, look.
Was it like that then?
No, I mean, it was different. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, Brown is a pretty precious place, isn't it? I mean, Brown is not Dartmouth, you know. It's not Princeton. It's not Yale. I think the social justice imperative, at least in my experience, I've been here since 2005, so that's 20 years, of our students is very keen. I think people want to make the world a better place. I don't mean to say that people at Dartmouth and Princeton and Yale don't also want to make the world a better place, but isn't there something peculiar about Brown's sensibility in this regard? Something identifiable in that regard? I think there is. I want to say I don't think there's anything wrong with going into finance and learning how markets work and, wanting to be successful. I think, even people who are trying to do good might do well if they were to attend to the bottom line and what it is that they do and so on. And I think the idea of profit is not a bad thing. I think individual remuneration in response to their contribution, even outsized remuneration, if you do something that's really extremely valuable, is entirely appropriate. I don't think it's anything to be apologized for. We could do a sociological analysis. What are their parents telling them? What is the social network in which they're embedded valuing? What is it rewarding? I assume there's more than one network, and I assume sometimes being able to endow the university where you were a student 25 years before is the crown achievement of a lifetime for some people. And I assume being able to spend decades not worrying about where the money was going to come from because you're in a barrio somewhere or you're in a remote village in Latin America, something like that, is also something that can be valued. So I'm sorry if I'm not answering directly, but.
Thanks for your question.
Hi, thank you. So I grew up in the DC area where I feel like diversity is a very lived experience. It's kind of where like the empathy you talked about comes just from observing your elbow mate in middle school. It's also where conversations about race, status, gender are very open and active. So coming to Brown, I was very surprised that the wokest people are definitely people who don't have that lived experience or don't seem to be. And their understanding of diversity, race, and all these things come from hyper-theorized intro classes that they might have taken once and now still quote. My question is, do you, and if you do, how do you teach diversity to students without them having afterwards go and scream, all resistance is justified, like they do at Brown sometimes, and quote it as a academic source that they learned in Anthro 101, let's say?
Tell me what it is. This is a genuine and not challenging question. How does your conception of, for example, diversity or injustice based on the DC situation differ from that person who's learned some ways of thinking from 3 or 4 books and a class and a mood and a phone? What's the difference? What's wrong with theirs, in other words?
We had a very real situation in one of my clubs. One of the people during a recruitment event, a new member or a potential new member told them that, I think it's weird that in the new version of Brave, the main actress is not from Scottish descent. The person in my club agreed with it or not or whatever. They got kicked out of their position for talking about race during a recruitment event. To me, I grew up in the area where that is a conversation you have over lunch, and you probably do have a Black student who will say, that's kind of weird, and you move on with your life. Like, it's such an active part of life to know that people around you are different, that conversations about it don't become the topic of the day, but rather one of the topics.
So, in other words, you think that they are fetishizing, and perhaps they've learned that that's the way to show that they're good people, but that the result is a kind of injustice after a while. So. And you would say, how do you change that? By being part of the general conversation that calls people on it. And that can be hard face to face. You're one of 9 people in the room. But if it's possible to single out the ones that are probably most open to understanding that you can be that exact kind of good person without peculiar performative episodes like that, then in my opinion, you're doing what the good work is. But it's one brick in the wall at a time. And something that you should always remember, if you don't already know this, and you probably do, is that almost never will anyone tell you, you're right, because we don't like to do that. But you look in their eyes and you can tell that they know that you're right. And they'll tell you that you were right about 9 months later. But just know that it's not going to end neatly, but you've done your job by getting your view out there.
We have 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you both for being here. This was like the Glenn Show live. The only thing that was missing is the advertisement for Ground News. My question to both of you is, how do you distinguish between contrarianism and provocation? That is, how would you distinguish between a contrarian who advances unusual positions and a provocateur who likes to push people's buttons? Are they two sides of the same coin, or is one more productive or more pernicious than the other?
That's a good question. I think the bomb thrower is more pernicious than the person who's willing to go against the grain if that's how they are inclined. And I think a bomb thrower will be all over the place. He'll just be throwing bombs. Today it'll be this way, tomorrow it'll be that way. It's always a nay. It's always a frown. It's always, a negative. Whereas a contrarian may surprise you by going against the grain, but presumably there's some structure there. There's going against the grain in the service of a view. And a person might be willing to change their mind, might be willing to learn something. Serious interlocutor is listening as well as talking, this kind of thing.
The professional provocateur often isn't very nice. Generally, the ones I've known are not kind people, because what they really want to do is just say, God damn it. That's the goal, and that's all they're doing. Whereas the contrarian, my sense of a contrarian is not somebody who sits and thinks, okay, how am I going to stir up the pot this week? But just who thinks, this is what I think. A lot of people who are smart and nice don't think this, but I know that a whole lot of other smart, nice people do think it, and I'm going to say it, despite that somebody might not like me. That's a contrarian. But that kind of person, in my view, is often somebody with more of a moral commitment. And after you've been around a while, you've met everybody. And the provocateurs are always interesting in a room, but they're mean, and they also tend not to last as long as the contrarians.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is our last question.
Professor Loury and Professor McWhorter, thank you guys so much for coming today. This was a great talk. And thank you, Professor Schiller, for being a great moderator. My name is Robert. I'm a junior here at Brown. And my question is actually kind of based on something that Mr. McWhorter or Professor McWhorter said right when he got here. So I think maybe a couple minutes after you arrived, you said something along the lines of, I think less people should go to college. And we sort of moved past it, but you've talked about it now several times.
Fewer. John McWhorter would not have said less people.
Deep down, I was thinking less, but
I apologize.
but I did say that.
And I was mostly just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what you envisioned that would do, and also why you think that fewer people attending college would encourage that. I'd also love to hear Glenn's perspective, whether he agrees or disagrees, but also maybe I'd like to hear about from an economic perspective, since I know that might be a little bit more your forte.
All right,
Whatever jobs people go out to do after 4 years of this wonderful thing, and I teach in the Columbia version of this, it's my default sense. I was a fac brat. But the truth is, whatever the jobs people go out and do, they really could have done it just as well without 4 years of living in a dorm and being taught King Lear, et cetera. That's something that we think of as default just kind of because of the GI Bill. And I think that people would benefit from going out into the world at 19 instead of 22 and just doing whatever it is they were going to do, be that working in a bank, be that starting a nonprofit, be that beginning to be a college professor by going to grad school. The idea that people aren't ready till they're 21 is perfectly arbitrary. I think that 16 and 17-year-olds are ready. So that's why. It's not that I don't think people should be educated. It's that I think a lot of the education should be backloaded into this 13th grade. But a lot of what happens, even at a Brown, even at a Columbia, 4 years is just a chance thing. We're used to that because it's all we've ever known. But I think we could, if we rolled back the tape, we wouldn't do it that way. That's what I meant.
I guess I mostly want to hear you speak about how it impacts equality for everyone rather than just like the kind of.
And then we're going to have to close it off.
Yeah. I would say very quickly,
I apologize.
college is too expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, all of that debt that people have to go into if they want to do that whole 4 years, or often even if they do the 2. And so equality is a central aspect of this sort of thing, not to mention that there would be more of a valuation on solid vocational jobs, which often earn a good salary as well. I don't think that we should think of the plumber as somehow not having had as much of the American experience as all of us. Anyway, Glenn, what do you?
Well, you want to look at the return on investment. It's going to be a difficult measurement problem, but you want to, you're putting in a certain amount of money at a certain stage in life, and you can calculate the extent to which that investment generates higher earnings, if that's your metric of what the payoff from going to college is. I think we don't want to get misled in thinking about this question by reference only to the upper tier, most elite and selective institutions. We want to think about community colleges. We want to think about, the places where the great fat part of the distribution of the population is residing, and we want to do this return on investment calculation. And we want to take opportunity costs seriously. 4 years from 18 to 22 is an enormous expenditure of limited time. You don't live forever. It's early on, so you got a tail to worry about what the consequences of doing it. And so what we do at that time becomes very important. And make work, running from class to class, taking remedial English and math stuff and whatnot may not be the best way to do that for a lot of people. So there's that. I mean, I think, too, lifelong learning shouldn't be discounted. The kinds of things, civic education, for example, that we want to get, not the 13-year, but what does it mean to be a citizen in the fullest sense of the word? What is community? What are my obligations to other people? What is beauty, art, et cetera? These are things that a person can cultivate. And as I have said already, I think the impulse to cultivate one's mastery and acquaintance with the greatest of human culture is something that should be instilled for a lifetime, not something that should happen only between 18 and 22.
Well, on that very eloquent note, I want to thank you so much, Professor John McWhorter and Professor Len Loury. And thank you so much to this fantastic audience, which was very patient, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, folks. My apologies. Apologies from Amtrak.